You're hearing this exactly as investigators found it. An unedited fragment of audio pulled from a damaged camcorder discovered deep inside the North Ridge backcountry. No names, no explanations, only the last 3 minutes before everything went silent. At first, it's nothing but the sound of someone running fast, tripping over roots, snapping branches, gasping like the air itself is being ripped out of their lungs. The microphone struggles to keep up, warping each desperate exhale. Then, a beam of light cuts through the dark. A flashlight, shaking so violently the forest blurs in chaotic streaks of white. It flickers against the trunks of towering pines, the glow catching nothing but empty space. And yet the runner is clearly fleeing from something. Listen carefully. That scream doesn't come from the person holding the camera. It comes from deeper in the treeline, far too deep for anyone to reach that fast. A walkie-talkie crackles to life on the runner's hip. A voice breaks in, shaky, terrified. "We're losing him. He just ran into the woods. Something's out here." The transmission cuts off mid-sentence, swallowed by static. The flashlight swings wildly as the runner looks over their shoulder, and for a split second we see a shape, a human silhouette darting across the narrow beam, sprinting the opposite direction. He's moving fast, arms flailing, stumbling through branches like he isn't watching where he's going. Whoever he is, he's running for his life. Then it happens. A sound that does not match any animal known to the region. A high, hollow wail that rises into a sharp, unnatural pitch. Not wolf, not elk, not anything investigators could identify in their report. It tears through the forest and freezes the runner mid-stride. The flashlight slips. The camera falls. It hits the ground sideways, tumbling once before landing half-buried in the dirt. The view is now tilted, crooked, staring across a patch of dead needles and tangled underbrush. Heavy footsteps approach, slow, deliberate, as if whatever is coming has no reason to hurry. For a half-second, just long enough for the lens to catch it, a tall, gaunt figure moves between the pines. Thin, elongated, its outline distorted by protrusions that resemble twisted antlers or branches climbing unnaturally from its skull. No face visible, no eyes reflecting the light, only a towering frame slipping silently through the dark. The footage ends there. What you've just heard is the final recording recovered from what investigators labeled the Pine Hollow incident. The footage was found several months after the campers disappeared, buried beneath a collapsed section of underbrush near an old game trail in the northern mountain region. The memory card was damaged, the casing cracked, but the audio inside survived long enough to raise far more questions than answers. The search teams who reviewed this clip described it as unlike anything recovered from a missing persons case in this region. Experienced rangers, men and women trained to recognize the calls of local wildlife, to track animals through miles of dense forest, were unable to identify the sounds heard in the background. The screams did not match recorded elk distress calls, nor the sharp, rising wails of a fox, nor the territorial cry of wolves. And the silhouette captured at the end of the fall, the tall, gaunt shape slipping between the trees, was noted only as humanoid in outline, but inconsistent with standard human proportions. This is the part of the investigation where the official reports grow quiet. Pages become redacted. Statements become inconclusive. And yet, the location where this footage was found was the same place where multiple campers vanished over the span of 2 weeks. No bodies, no confirmed cause of death, only abandoned gear, scattered belongings, and signs of flight deep in the trees. So the question becomes, what forced a group of campers to run blindly into the forest at night? What moved with them, not behind them but around them, as if guiding the direction they fled? And why did multiple investigators describe the scene as not consistent with any known animal behavior in their official statements? Before we can answer that, we must look backward. Far before the Pine Hollow campground existed, before logging roads carved the region open, before any modern maps marked the land. Because long before these disappearances, long before camcorders captured silhouettes slipping through pine trees, The people native to this land spoke of something that lived in the deep woods. They described it not as a creature in the way we think of animals, but as a warning, a tale of hunger so powerful it reshaped a person into something unrecognizable. Across Algonquin and Cree traditions, preserved in public historical records and early anthropological writings from the 1800s and early 1900s, the word appears again and again. Wendigo, not a simple monster, not a campfire invention, but a symbol of insatiable hunger, a being associated with winter starvation, cannibalism, and a transformation driven by greed and desperation. Descriptions differ between regions, but many of the oldest accounts collected by early researchers note similar traits. A towering, emaciated figure, unnatural strength, and the ability to lure victims by mimicking familiar voices. These stories predate modern horror by centuries. They existed long before the first ranger report, long before the first disappearance attributed to the Pine Hollow area, and long before the recovered footage you heard moments ago. Tonight, in this documentary, we're going to examine every part of this mystery, methodically, piece by piece. One continuous investigation. We'll begin with the survivors, those few who were found after running miles from the campground, disoriented, injured, and unable to clearly describe what chased them. Then we'll move through the ranger reports filed in the weeks after the campers vanished. Reports detailing unusual tracks, strange calls echoing through valleys, and signs of violent struggle that did not match any known predator in the region. From there, we'll review the reconstructed timeline built from recovered footage, the same kind captured in the final, frantic recording where the flashlight beam shakes across the forest floor. Next, we'll dive into the documented folklore, historical accounts, public domain cultural descriptions, and early references to the Wendigo legend gathered by scholars in the 19th and early 20th centuries. These sources provide a framework, not of fiction, but of how people once understood the deep wilderness and the dangers lurking within it. Finally, we'll bring everything together in a final analysis. What happened at Pine Hollow? What forced these campers to flee into darkness? And what explanation, if any, can account for the evidence left behind? Stay with me. The ground we're about to cover is dense, dark, and filled with more questions than answers. But this story does not begin with myth. It begins with the truth left behind in those final recordings. And the deeper we look into the forest, the more it begins to look back. The recovered footage that marks the beginning of the Pine Hollow trip is almost ordinary. The kind of recordings you find on any group's camping weekend. 5 campers. Young, inexperienced, excited to spend 3 nights off-grid in the northern wilderness. The first files on the card show nothing unusual. A long stretch of gravel road winding between thick pines. The laughter of friends hauling coolers out of the trunk. A shaky, casual pan of the campsite. A clearing surrounded by old-growth trees, their trunks spaced just tightly enough to swallow the horizon. In the distance, a ridge rises like a wall, covered in dense fir and spruce. This part of the forest is remote but not unknown. Hikers use the trailheads. Hunters pass through during season. And yet, even the official ranger notes describe the deeper areas as rarely traveled, with wildlife patterns that shift unpredictably through the year. The campers begin setting up their tents. One clips the camera to a branch while they unload gear. The lens captures the ordinary rhythm of a campsite being built. Nylon snapping in the wind, tent poles clicking together, firewood being stacked. Nothing in these early minutes indicates what the night will bring. But then, as the sun dips behind the ridge, the tone of the footage changes. At first, the sounds are subtle, barely audible under the crackle of the fire. A whistle, faint, uneven, carried by the breeze. Then another, slightly lower, echoing back from the opposite side of the clearing. Forest whistling is not unusual. The wind can thread through branches in strange ways, and some birds produce high-pitched calls that resemble human tonal patterns. But the whistle captured on this recording does not match any documented species known to inhabit the region. It's too controlled, too rhythmically spaced, as if the source were imitating something it had heard before. A few minutes later, a new pattern emerges. A clicking sound, deep in the trees. 3 clicks, then silence. 3 more clicks, then silence again. Investigators later noted that the sound had the cadence of knuckle joints snapping, though no definitive explanation was offered. The footage continues. The hikers try to ignore the noise at first, filming themselves roasting food over the fire. But the camera shifts subtly, its operator occasionally turning toward the tree line. A shadow moves between the trunks. Slow, stationary, then gone again. As night falls completely, the footage captures a moment that later stood out to investigators. The camera, still running, turns toward the western edge of camp. The narrator's voice softens now, as though drawing the viewer in. In the dim glow of the campfire, the camera catches what appears to be a figure. Not approaching, not moving, just standing at the edge of the clearing. Every instinct suggests it should be another camper, but the proportions are off. The posture is too rigid. The arms hang at an unnatural angle. And while the fire illuminates the foreground, the figure does not reflect any light at all. Early documentation from Algonquin and Cree traditions speaks of beings that lingered at the edge of human settlements, watching with stillness that bordered on inhuman. The purpose varied. Sometimes curiosity, sometimes hunger, sometimes something deeper, but always silent. The camera shakes as the operator turns away, either unnerved or dismissive. When it pans back only seconds later, the figure is gone. Morning arrives with the next cut in the footage. Birds calling. Light filtering through the canopy. The fire burnt to white ash. But something is different. Along the perimeter of the camp, in the soft soil between the moss and pine needles, the campers find tracks. Not bear. Not elk. The impressions are elongated. Narrower than human footprints but deeper, as if something with tremendous weight had stepped there during the night. The toes appear pointed, almost claw-like. They don't follow a straight line. Instead, they weave around the tents in a wide circle. And then, just a few yards from the clearing, the prints stop, abruptly. No return trail. No scattered earth. No sign of any creature leaping or flying. Simply an ending, as though the maker of the tracks vanished into the air. Rangers familiar with the region have noted that some predators, such as mountain lions, can climb trees quickly and quietly. But these prints do not resemble any cat. The spacing is wider. The depth is inconsistent with a leaping animal. And the claw marks point forward, not downward, something not commonly seen in tree climbing species. More footage from that morning captures the next discovery. A fallen tree. Its trunk stripped nearly 10 feet above the ground. The bark is peeled downward in long scratches, far higher than any black bear in this region could naturally reach. The marks are vertical, deep, parallel. One ranger later noted that the pattern matched neither natural animal behavior nor tool marks. It appeared, in his words, as if something tall had raked its claws downward from a height no human could reach without equipment. But perhaps the most unsettling piece of evidence from that first day is found a little farther from camp. The camera records the group approaching a small clearing. On the ground lies a deer, or what remains of one, partially eaten. No signs of scavenger tearing. No scattered tracks around the carcass. Just the body, its ribcage exposed, placed deliberately on a patch of flattened moss. Predators rarely leave clean displays. But cultural stories from northern tribes, stories preserved in early public domain ethnographic texts, describe something else. Something that brought signs of its presence close to human settlements. Not only to feed, but to warn, or to lure. The campers laugh nervously when they first see the skeleton, trying to shake off the dread building around them. In their minds, this is just wildlife, just the forest, just an unlucky deer. But the deeper context tells another story. They believe in these early hours that they are alone. They are not. Something is watching them from beyond the tree-line, following their movements, circling their camp in patterns too deliberate to ignore. This is the first day, the first night, the first sign that the Pine Hollow campground is not as empty as it seems. And as darkness approaches again, the woods prepare to reveal much, much more. When the sun dropped behind the ridge that first night, the woods around Pine Hollow changed. The campers, 5 friends who had documented nearly every moment of their arrival, continued filming long after darkness fell. What begins as harmless chatter around a fire soon turns into the first undeniable sign that something else had stepped into their circle of light. At 9:42 p.m., according to the recovered audio files, one of them, Eric, asked the others to stay quiet. He said he heard something repeating his voice from deeper inside the trees. Not an echo, not a trick of the wind, a repetition, soft, off-tempo, a few seconds late, as if something were learning the shape of his words. On the footage, you can hear him test it. He says, "Hello," and faintly a response, not identical to his tone, but low, stretched, almost as if the speaker had never spoken human words before. A mimicry phenomenon is something historically mentioned in several northern woodland legends, particularly in older Algonquian folklore, where malevolent spirits were said to lure victims away by imitating familiar voices. Nothing in the campers' files suggests they knew those stories. They only knew they were not alone. Within minutes, whispering surrounded their tents. Not conversational whispering, more like breath being pushed through teeth. Circling, moving, never fast, never rushing, almost deliberate. The fire pops once, and in that sharp moment of brightness the camera catches something. Behind the flames, just outside the reach of the lanterns, a long, thin limb, almost an arm, sweeps between 2 trees. It moves too smoothly to belong to any known wildlife. Too tall, too narrow, and most telling of all, it moves upright. The campers freeze, but none of them run. They simply whisper among themselves, trying to decide whether to investigate or stay put. Fear and curiosity pulling at them equally. At 10:17 p.m., one of the friends, Daniel, vanishes from the frame. Not dramatically, not with a scream. He simply wanders toward the treeline, following a voice calling his name. A voice that sounded, according to the others, exactly like one of them. He is gone for 15 minutes. When he returns, the footage shows him pale, sweat across his forehead despite the cold mountain air. He tells them he saw a figure ahead of him, someone he thought he recognized, until it turned sideways and stretched in a way no human frame should bend. He remembers following it, and then nothing, a blank spot in his memory. The group tries to shake it off, accusing each other of playing tricks, tiredness, maybe the altitude. But the next discoveries wipe away any sense of safety they had left. In the glow of their lanterns, they find small bones arranged in patterns beside the trail. Rib bones and vertebrae from small animals laid out in triangular shapes. No scavenger does that. No natural process explains it. And near their tents, one tree stands out, its bark stripped in spirals, curling like peeled skin from top to bottom, far higher than any person could reach without climbing gear. The camera lingers on that stripped trunk, the recorder buzzing faintly from interference. And as the wind moves through the branches overhead, the group begins to understand. Something is watching them. Something is moving with intent. Something that knows they are here. By the next morning, the fear from the first night had settled into something quieter. Something the campers tried to brush off as nerves and exhaustion. They cooked breakfast, reorganized their tents, and convinced themselves the strange noises and mimicry were nothing more than the forest playing tricks. But just after noon, the first person vanished. According to the recovered timestamps, Eli left the campsite at 12:14 p.m. to collect firewood no more than 50 yards from where the others sat. He told them he'd stay within shouting distance. He carried a small hatchet, a camera clipped to his chest strap, and a bright orange backpack they had all joked was impossible to lose sight of. No one heard a scream. No one saw movement. One moment he was there, the next gone. At 12:23 p.m., the group noticed the silence. They called for him, first casually, then louder. You can hear the shift in their voices on the audio. Irritation sliding smoothly into unease. When there was still no answer, the search began. The footage from the next hour is disorienting. Rapid pans of the forest, crunching footsteps, overlapping calls of Eli. Their confidence fades quickly as they push deeper between the pines. They spread out, then regroup, then split again. Every few minutes they call out, and every few minutes the forest gives them only wind in response. But at 1:07 p.m., one of them, Lena, finds something. It is Eli's backpack, torn open down the center. Not cut, not ripped by branches, pulled apart, the fabric frayed outward, threads stretched unnaturally wide as if something with immense force had yanked it open in a single motion. Inside they find nothing of his belongings. No camera, no hatchet, no food wrappers, all of it gone. Only a half-crushed water bottle remains, smeared with dirt and something darker. A few feet away, the narrator describes the leaves. Small droplets of blood, scattered lightly, not pooled. Droplets that suggest neither a fatal injury nor an accidental cut. Just enough to indicate struggle. Enough to say Eli was still alive when whatever happened, happened. But the most disturbing clue lies beside those droplets. One human footprint, Eli's size, facing deeper into the forest, and next to it a much larger impression. A shape not matching bear, elk, or any known wildlife. For long, claw-like indentations dug deep into the soil, spacing wide enough to imply something tall, upright, but heavy. Claw marks are often mentioned in historical accounts tied loosely to the Wendigo legend, not as monstrous bestial features, but as symbols of abnormal strength and unnatural hunger described in Algonquian oral traditions. Though these traditional accounts focus on spiritual transformation rather than a physical creature, the imagery remains eerily consistent across regions. The campers do not make this connection. They only see the impossible. As they continue searching, the forest begins to respond in ways that break the natural order. Their handheld radio, used only for short-range communication, starts picking up breathing. Slow, heavy, deliberate. None of them admit to hearing it at first, each assuming it's interference. But the breathing grows louder each time they call Eli's name, almost as if the source is drawing closer. At 1:32 p.m., the camera catches a brief moment of eyeshine deep in the brush. Not an animal's emerald reflection. Not the common amber of deer or the red flare of raccoons. This glow is pale, almost white, and higher than a human head. It flickers once, then disappears. Moments later, they come across a tree. Not fallen. Not decayed. Snapped in half at shoulder height, the wood split cleanly like a piece of dry kindling. This would take extraordinary force, far beyond anything a black bear could generate, and black bears are the only large predators known in that region. The group begins to panic. Then comes the final sign, the one that breaks them. From somewhere deeper in the woods, someone calls for help. It is Eli's voice, clear, recognizable, but wrong. The rhythm is off. The tones stretch too long. A voice repeating his own name, the way the mimicry had repeated Eric's the night before. Historical accounts throughout Cree and other Algonquian traditions mention this type of lure. A voice calling from the forest, imitating the lost, the familiar, the trusted. A voice used to draw people off the safe path. On the recording, one camper says, "Eli, stay where you are." And another whispers, "That's not him." They argue for a moment, fear rising, confusion taking hold. And then, almost reluctantly, they begin moving toward the voice. The footage cuts there, mid-step, mid-breath, as the forest swallows them whole. By late evening, when Eli had still not returned, the remaining campers finally made the decision to radio for help. Their voices, ragged, panicked, were recorded in the ranger station logs from that night. The call wasn't dramatic, but it was urgent. A missing person is always treated seriously in these mountains, and Pine Hollow in particular had a reputation older than any of them realized. When the search and rescue team arrived just after midnight, they brought with them not only equipment, but a quiet unease. According to the ranger incident logs, Pine Hollow had a history most visitors never knew about. The first recorded disappearance goes back to 1922, when a trapper vanished under circumstances that were never explained. His camp was found intact, his tools neatly arranged, but he was gone, No footprints, no animal tracks, no sign of struggle. In 1949, 2 hunters reported finding remains in the same region, described in the official notes as partially consumed in a manner inconsistent with bear predation. Black bears were common here, but the wounds didn't match claw patterns or feeding behavior. The ranger who inspected the scene wrote that the injuries appeared selective, almost deliberate. That report was never widely circulated, but the original memo survives in public archives. Over the decades, small incidents continued. Missing hikers, abandoned campsites, strange tracks. Nothing proven, nothing solved. Just patterns, silent, unsettling patterns that pointed to something lurking deeper in these northern woods. As investigators sifted through these old cases, night vision cameras, sniffing dogs, and floodlights cutting through the fog, they began to see connections that mirrored the legends told by indigenous communities long before modern borders existed. In Algonquin lore, particularly among groups in the northern forests, there are accounts of a spirit or entity associated with winter starvation, isolation, and extreme hunger. This being, often called the Wendigo, is described in oral traditions as a symbol of greed, cannibalism, and transformation. The core of the tradition is not a physical monster, but a warning about the human capacity for destructive hunger. Among the Cree, similar stories describe an entity marked by relentless hunger, an emaciated, gaunt form, unnatural senses, and the ability to mimic the voices of the living. These stories were never told as entertainment. They were moral warnings passed down through generations. They were lessons about survival, respect, and the dangers that come with desperation. But what unsettled the investigators that night were not the legends alone. It was how the signs at Pine Hollow lined up with them. The ranger logs described the scene objectively. Eli's torn backpack recovered. Clawed impressions beside human footprints. Droplets of blood trailing into the trees. A snapped tree trunk. Reports of distant mimicry calling the missing camper's name. Each detail was logged with professional restraint. None of the investigators suggested folklore outright, but the written hesitation is clear. There is a moment in one ranger's notes where he writes, "Tracks inconsistent with known mammals. Behavior atypical of predatory animals. Further investigation required." That is the closest the official documents come to admitting that what they encountered did not fit within the natural world. To build context, it draws upon one of the most referenced historical events tied loosely to Wendigo tradition, the Swift Runner case. In the winter of 1879, Swift Runner, a member of the Cree, was involved in a widely documented incident of cannibalism tied culturally to Wendigo beliefs. While the case centered on human actions, not on a creature, it demonstrates how deeply the concept of the Wendigo existed in northern communities and how seriously it was treated at the time. This case is now public domain and remains one of the most cited historical references in discussions of Wendigo lore. By presenting this history, the investigators hoped to understand whether Pine Hollow's strange signs mirrored the symbolic warnings from these traditional stories, or whether something else entirely was unfolding. As the search widened, the ranger team found more anomalies. Tree trunks with bark peeled in long spirals. Small bones arranged deliberately on stones. Faint breathing through the search radio frequencies. Lights catching pale eyeshine far beyond the tree line. None of these details were included in the public press summary. Only in the internal ranger files' dry clinical notes do they appear. What the investigators did not yet know was that Eli's disappearance was only the beginning, and that the forest around them had already grown unnaturally silent. When investigators reviewed the recovered footage, ranger logs, and the fragments of audio collected from Pine Hollow, a strange consistency began to emerge. Not just chaos, not just panic, but patterns, behaviors repeated over and over, each pointing to something that seemed to know exactly what it was doing. These patterns align disturbingly well with elements found in Algonquian and Cree Wendigo traditions. Stories describing a being that stalks, isolates, and manipulates its prey with unnatural patience. While traditional indigenous teachings portray the Wendigo primarily as a spiritual embodiment of greed, hunger, and transformation, many descriptions across the Northern Territories share similar, recurring themes, themes that echoed what happened in Pine Hollow. One of the most consistent behaviors documented in the campers' footage is stalking. Not rushed, not chaotic, but controlled. The cameras pick up distant movement long before anything comes close. Branches sway where there is no wind. Eyeshine appears and disappears behind trunks, always at the edge of visibility. This matches many traditional descriptions of the Wendigo as a figure associated with the deep forest, watching from the shadows, approaching only when the victim is completely isolated. Something else becomes clear from the recovered files. Whatever moved around the camp played with them. Items were displaced. Small bones appeared in new arrangements. Trees were marked higher and higher each night. This behavior does not align with any natural predator. Bears do not stalk for hours for no purpose. Mountain lions do not rearrange objects or test human boundaries in silence. But in several northern indigenous narratives, the Wendigo is described as a being of relentless hunger. Methodical, intelligent, patient. Not a wild animal, but something that watches its victims weaken over time. The investigators note a chilling pattern across multiple disappearances dating as far back as the early 1900s. One person goes missing first. Always one. In Pine Hollow, the creature's first decisive act was isolating Eli. In the 1922 Trapper case, the man separated from his partner by only a short distance before vanishing. In the 1949 report, one hunter strayed uphill alone after hearing something like a person in the trees. This repeated tactic, singling out, separating, removing, is consistent with the way many oral traditions describe the Wendigo preying upon the vulnerable or the isolated. Again, the folklore served primarily as moral guidance, but the parallels are difficult to ignore. The recordings capture it clearly. Voices calling from the woods, voices identical to the campers, but wrong. Flattened tones, stretched syllables, sounding human yet somehow hollow. Voice mimicry appears in several northern tales, where the creature lures victims away by imitating loved ones or crying for help. These stories vary from region to region, but the theme persists. In Pine Hollow, investigators documented the phenomenon multiple times. Eli's name whispered from beyond the treeline. Eric's voice repeated from a distance. A call for help in an impossible direction. Nothing in the natural world explains this. One of the most unsettling details in the ranger accounts is the silence. Whatever moved around the tents did so without snapping twigs or disturbing underbrush. Yet it left deep impressions in the soil and claw marks far above human reach. Traditional descriptions of the Wendigo often depict it as gaunt, emaciated, impossibly tall, light enough to move swiftly, strong enough to break trees, silent enough to appear without warning. The contrast between strength and stealth is one of the most consistent traits across stories. The investigators recorded multiple indicators of force far exceeding that of known wildlife. A tree snapped in half at chest height. Another peeled in spirals, bark removed as if twisted by powerful hands. Eli's backpack torn clean, not slashed. Deep claw-like impressions beside human footprints. These findings do not confirm a creature, but they do show the presence of something with deliberate intent and considerable strength. As the second night approached, the threats became more direct. A deer carcass beside the tent. At 3:13 a.m., the camera outside the tent captures something placed beside it. A freshly killed deer. Not dragged. Not eaten. Placed. Its body unmarked except for the neck, twisted at an impossible angle. Predators do not present their kills. But as investigators noted, this mirrored earlier cases from the 1920s and 1940s, where carcasses were found intentionally positioned near campsites, as though meant to provoke or intimidate, something leaning against the tent. At 3:47 a.m., one camper wakes abruptly. The tent fabric is bowed inward. Something is leaning on it from outside. Not a hand, not a paw, a weight, steady, unhurried, pressing the nylon inward by several inches. He whispers for another camper to look. The camera catches the wall of the tent compressing, then, in a single smooth motion, releasing. No footsteps, no retreat, just the impression fading as though whatever pressed against the tent simply drifted backward into the dark. Patterns were forming now. Hunger, patience, isolation, manipulation, all of it drawn straight from the underpinnings of northern Wendigo lore, legends that began as moral warnings, and ended up reflected piece by piece in the events of Pine Hollow. And as investigators pieced this together, one truth grew harder to ignore. The thing in those woods was not hunting for food. It was hunting for fear. By the fourth day of the official search, investigators shifted their attention toward a ravine, an area notorious in older ranger reports for sudden drop-offs and unstable ground. It was there, half-wedged beneath a fallen branch, that they discovered a small handheld camcorder. Mud-caked, water-damaged, but surprisingly intact. The recovery team logged it as item number 14, noting that its battery had been completely drained. When they eventually powered it using lab equipment, they found a single video file, one that would become the most disturbing piece of evidence gathered from the entire site. Before we continue, what you are about to hear is a reconstruction. The original audio was degraded, unintelligible in several places. But the visuals, even partially corrupted, left very little to interpretation. The video opens in near total darkness. The only light comes from the camcorder's weak night mode, a wash of pale green, flickering at the edges. You can hear breathing, panicked, shallow. The camera shakes violently as branches snap underfoot. Whoever is holding it is running, moving as fast as they can through dense forest. Then, off in the distance, a noise, not a roar, not a human scream, something in between, a kind of long, tearing wail, reminiscent of the Wendigo scream, described in numerous Cree and Algonquin oral histories. Many accounts describe it as sounding like wind passing through a hollowed ribcage, layered with something that resembles a human voice crying for help. The scream comes again, closer. The camera jolts to a stop. It swings toward a cluster of trees. And for one brief second, just a fraction of a moment, something tall moves behind them, much taller than a human. The silhouette is thin, impossibly elongated, its joints bending at angles that don't match any known animal. Investigators later paused the footage frame by frame. What they noted was consistent with traditional Wendigo descriptions found in 19th and early 20th century ethnographic collections. Gaunt, emaciated body, long limbs, hollowed chest, head that appears deer-like or skull-like, depending on the region's folklore. Movement described as too fast for its size. This matches with Algonquin narratives recorded in public domain texts, where the creature is described as tall as the tallest pine, yet moving with the silence of snow falling. The footage continues. The camera holder begins whispering, desperate, cracking with fear. Most of the words are lost to distortion, but one line stands out clearly. A trembling whisper. It's copying my voice. It's right behind me. This detail, vocal mimicry, is one of the most widely cited traits in Wendigo folklore. In several Cree stories collected in the early 20th century, the creature is said to lure victims by imitating a familiar voice, often blending hunger with deception. The whisperer's breathing grows ragged. The camera is lifted slightly, as if they're trying to see behind themselves without turning their head. Then, dead silence. No wind, no insects. Even the forest seems to be holding its breath. For 7 full seconds, the camcorder records nothing but stillness. Then the image glitches, hard like the tape is being stretched. Through the distortion, something emerges from the darkness behind the trees. At first, it appears upright, but then it drops to all fours and moves in a way that no human body could tolerate. Fast. Too fast. A blur of limbs, joints bending spider-like. The camera holder gasps, stumbles backward, and the camcorder slams onto the ground. The last few seconds are tilted sideways, half buried in dirt, capturing only fragments of motion. A hand, thin, skeletal, reaching out. A shadow bending in an impossible arc. A face, white, stretched, barely visible before the feed collapses into static. The recording ends there. No timestamp, no identifiable features from the victim. Nothing that could conclusively prove what they encountered. But matching this footage with the physical signs found at the scene, the shredded bark, the enormous tracks, the ongoing pattern of disappearances, investigators could not ignore the parallels to long-standing indigenous folklore describing a predatory, cannibalistic spirit of winter hunger. A name passed down through generations. Wendigo. When the sun finally dipped below the tree line, the woods around the campers seemed to tighten, as if the forest itself had decided there would be no more escape tonight. They moved quickly, what was left of them, packing only what they could carry. Every zipper sounded too loud. Every snapped twig felt like a warning. They headed toward the old logging road Ranger Holloway had marked on the map, the same road used decades ago before the forest reclaimed it. It was supposed to lead them out. A straight shot. Safety. But nothing in these woods ever stayed where humans left it. As they reached the first bend in the road, they stopped. A massive tree, freshly pushed over, lay across the path. Not cut, not fallen, pushed, its roots still wet with torn earth, as if something had ripped it down with raw, impossible strength. The narrator's tone hardens. Many documented Wendigo tales from Algonquin and Cree oral traditions describe it as possessing strength beyond anything human, capable of crushing trees, bending branches, and hunting in areas people once believed were too fortified to be breached. And now, the campers were standing before evidence of exactly that. They tried to detour around the fallen trunk, but the moment they stepped off the trail, the woods changed. The air grew colder, heavier, silent. As they pushed deeper between the trees, the silence was broken by a sound they had come to fear more than anything else. Footsteps, but not human ones. Long strides, slow, deliberate, pacing them. No one spoke. No one had to. They all knew what it was. In many traditional Wendigo stories, the creature is said to stalk its prey for hours, sometimes days, not out of necessity, but out of cruelty. It isolates. It waits. It enjoys the fear as much as the hunt. And that was exactly what was happening now. Miles into the forest, the group's nerves finally began to slip. One of them, Mark, turned to check behind them, flashlight trembling in his hand. He called out shakily, "Is anyone else hearing that?" Before anyone could answer, the footsteps stopped. And then, from somewhere ahead of them, Mark's own voice replied, "Yeah, I hear it." But the real Mark was still standing with the group, frozen in terror. Voice mimicry is one of the most consistent details across public domain Wendigo accounts, reported for generations, used to lure victims deeper into the woods. Mark broke. Panic took over. He ran. The others screamed after him, but he was already gone, his flashlight bouncing wildly through the darkness. Then came the sound, a single high-pitched scream, cut short, cut violently, and then nothing. No echo, no movement, just the forest swallowing the noise whole. The remaining pair, now trembling, exhausted, and out of time, pressed on until they reached what looked like a break in the treeline. There, half-buried under brush and age, was an abandoned shack. Old, rotting, leaning slightly to one side, probably a remnant from the same logging operation decades before. With nowhere else to go, they rushed inside. Shacks like these dot the old northern logging territories. Many of the surviving ranger accounts mention them as places where search teams found evidence of past disappearances. Floors scratched, doors broken, sometimes dried blood embedded in the walls. Inside, the pair shoved everything they could find against the door. Broken shelves, a rusted chair, pieces of splintered wood. Their breathing filled the space, shaky and rapid. The wind outside died abruptly, and then they heard it. A slow, heavy exhale, right on the other side of the wall. The shack shifted slightly. Dust fell from the ceiling beams. Something enormous was leaning against it, sniffing long, deep inhales, like an animal trying to memorize a scent. Then, a second inhale. Closer, lower, far too close to the ground for anything human. Across oral folklore, the Wendigo is described as impossibly lean yet monstrously strong. Its movements can be silent, but its breathing has been described as wind inside a corpse, cold and suffocating. The two inside the shack clamped their hands over their mouths as the sniffing moved along the wall, slow, deliberate drags of air, circling them. Then everything stopped. Silence. Complete silence. The pair dared to hope, just briefly, that maybe it had left. And that's when the entire side of the shack caved in with a single blow. Wood exploded inward. The barricades snapped like twigs. Debris scattered in all directions. The last thing the camera captured, before the narrator transitions into a final, breath-tightening close, was the shack's interior flooding with darkness. A towering shape, distorted by motion, crawled inside with a speed that didn't seem physically possible. A scream. A hit. The camera slams sideways. Static. A final, wet impact. Then the recording cuts out. No further footage was recovered. No remains were found. And to this day, the area surrounding the abandoned logging road remains unmarked on most maps. But the patterns, the mimicry, the strength, the missing persons, all align with some of the oldest Wendigo traditions recorded in public domain indigenous folklore. Whatever hunted them, it wasn't human. Dawn came cold and gray over the ridge, lighting a forest that felt disturbingly untouched. No signs of struggle visible from a distance. No smoke, no movement. Just a silent tree-line swallowing the early morning fog. When the search and rescue teams arrived, they expected to find lost hikers, maybe injured, frightened, but alive. Instead, they found something else. As the narrator speaks, the tone shifts into investigative calm. According to multiple ranger reports from similar wilderness cases throughout the 20th century, early discovery sites often contained blood, torn clothing, and signs of a violent retreat, yet strikingly few human remains. The team's first discovery was a scattering of blood on a bed of pine needles, dried and rust-colored. It trailed in broken arcs, as if something had been dragged or something had been chased. Nearby bushes were bent and broken, crushed under heavy weight. Next came shredded fabric, caught on low branches. Some pieces cleanly sliced, others torn with alarming force. A jacket sleeve, a strip of backpack webbing, a torn hood, but nothing else. No bodies, no footprints that made sense. These findings are consistent with many wilderness disappearances scattered across public historical records, where search parties note signs of sudden flight, torn clothing, and missing persons, events sometimes attributed in local folklore to the Wendigo. As the teams pressed deeper into the woods, they noticed something strange. The forest was quiet. Not just normal morning quiet, completely silent. No birds, no insects, no distant movement. An unnatural stillness frequently mentioned in older Algonquin and Cree stories, described as a warning of the creature's presence. But the searchers did find someone. Miles away, far from where the shredded campsite remnants lay, a single survivor was found wandering the old logging corridor, dehydrated, weak, and barely responsive. Dirt streaked across his face, his eyes unfocused, his clothes torn as if by branches or claws. When approached, he recoiled at the sound of human voices. And then he repeated the one sentence he seemed capable of forming, over and over like a broken record. It kept calling my name. It kept calling my name. Sometimes whispering it. Sometimes shaking as he said it. Sometimes staring into the trees behind the rescue team, as if expecting the voice to return. Voice mimicry, specifically a creature calling out in the voice of a victim or loved one, is one of the most frequently documented traits in public Wendigo lore. Many historical stories describe it as a lure, an attempt to draw people deeper into the wilderness. The survivor's condition worsened when rangers attempted to question him. He said he had run from something tall, something that moved faster than it should have, something that always kept just out of sight until it didn't. He remembered hearing footsteps circling his tent nights earlier. He remembered following a voice that sounded like his own. He remembered seeing antlers in the dark, though Wendigo descriptions vary among tribes and stories, some depicting antlers, some not. But when asked about the final night, he shook his head violently and whispered, "It wasn't human. It wasn't human." Search teams reported additional unsettling findings. Ranger Daniels described large shapes moving through the brush the night before they found the survivor. Branches snapping. Heavy, bipedal movement. But when flashlights were shined toward the noise, there was nothing there. Rangers have historically reported unexplained movement in regions associated with missing person clusters, though these accounts remain anecdotal. Still, in the context of folklore surrounding the Wendigo, such sightings often align with traditional descriptions of a stalking presence. Despite extensive searching, no bodies were ever recovered. No clear trail. No footprints identifiable as human. Only fragments of a struggle, and a survivor too traumatized to give a full account. In the final moments of this arc, the narrator's tone drops into a chilling quiet. In documented wilderness disappearances where folklore is invoked, the absence of remains is often considered the most disturbing evidence of all, because it suggests that whatever took them intended that they would never be found. The narrator speaks over a slow fade out from the aftermath scene. Trees swaying, distant wind, the forest returning to its quiet, indifferent stillness. Months after the original search ended, after the reports were filed and the survivor was taken into care, one last piece of evidence surfaced. A hiker, miles from the original campsite, discovered a small camcorder wedged between two fallen logs. Weather-worn, half-buried, the casing cracked from impact. But when investigators retrieved the memory card, it still held a final audio file. No video, just sound. At first, it was nothing but static, and wind moving through the trees. A long pause, crackling, brush shifting, something heavy moving just out of microphone range. Then, a whisper, soft, breathless, drawn out like someone imitating speech rather than speaking it. A name. The name of one of the search rangers who had been on site during the original investigation. There were no surviving campers left to call his name. No one else out there to mimic. And the ranger whose name was spoken was miles away at the time of the recording. A second whisper follows, closer this time, as if leaning directly into the microphone. The same name, but the tone is wrong. Too thin, too stretched, too hungry. Whatever was in that forest, it learned their voices. And according to the most recent recording, it's still using them.